This is NBC Nightly News, reported by Tom Brokaw.
Good evening. Just 2 weeks ago, Walter Mondale won nearly 50% of the vote in the Iowa caucuses, and Senator Gary Hart finished a distant second. Tonight, Mondale is fighting for his political life, and Hart is the new star of the race for the Democratic presidential nomination. Mondale was saying today, "I'm in trouble. I need your help." This after he lost the main caucuses to Hart. Tonight, Lisa Myers, who covers the Mondale campaign for NBC News, describes what the former vice president is trying to do to recover.
Now shows Hart leading Mondale 41-29. The mood for the day was set as Mondale began his round of the morning talk shows.
After you lose Maine, you have to put your own damn mic on.
Later, a Secret Service agent closed a door in his face. Mondale pleaded for voters to look beyond Hart's youthful image and ask who Gary Hart really is.
The message sending is over. The posturing is over. Now we're coming down to picking a real live person.
Mondale's advisors claim that he still could win a protracted battle for the nomination, but they concede he may not be able to hold on if Hart continues to surge. They maintain that Mondale's attacks on Hart are beginning to work and averted an even worse defeat in Maine. Today, while emphasizing his concern for the downtrodden, Mondale accelerated those attacks. He went beyond Hart's record to suggest that the senator lacks compassion, that he doesn't care about people.
He wrote a book about his vision of America, and you need an FBI investigator to find one word in there of expressing concern about people who are in trouble.
Mondale now looks to next week's big primaries in the South, which he always has said would be critical in this race. But where he once hoped to lock up the nomination, he will be fighting for his political life. Lisa Myers, NBC News, with the Mondale campaign in Boston.
Tonight, an in-depth look at the man who has exploded out of the early rounds of the drive for the Democratic presidential nomination. NBC's chief political correspondent Roger Mudd on the rise of Gary Hart.
You know, most Americans don't think of themselves as liberal or conservatives. They just don't. Ideologues in both parties do. Americans don't.
What you just heard is the key to understanding the phenomenal success of this 47-year-old, self-controlled, dispassionate senator who is making his living off the politically rootless in America. The World War II baby boomers who were weaned on television, grew up with computers, but have lost their appetite for political ideology. Gary Hart's beginnings in this small railroad town in Kansas, Ottawa, provide few clues to his current fame. He lived on South Sycamore Street in this bungalow, the son of Carl and Nina Hartpence. His family would later change its name to Hart. The father sold farm machinery. They were Eisenhower Republicans, and they belonged to the conservative Evangelical Church of the Nazarene. At the Ottawa High School, Hart was a straight arrow, was manager of the basketball team, was editor of the newspaper, was a first-class student. But his 10th grade math teacher, Nora Evans, has no vivid memory of him.
He was not a person to push himself out, and you think of a politician as being a pusher.
A scholarship took Hart to Bethany Nazarene College near Oklahoma City, where he got the Good Citizen Award and where he met and married Olitha Ludwig, whose father had been the college president. For Gary Hart, the transition from this fundamentalist college to managing the presidential campaign of George McGovern was an enormous one, influenced no doubt by degrees from Yale in both law and divinity, and work in both Kennedy campaigns. Frank Mankiewicz, the McGovern press secretary, says Hart was cool even then.
I remember his unflappability. But I mean, Gary is an analyst. He's not a reactor. He doesn't say, "Oh God, we got to do this and we got to do it in a hurry." He said, "Let's see what all the elements are here."
The McGovern disaster of '72 did not slow Hart down. 2 years later, he got elected to the Senate. 6 years later, he was one of the few senators to survive the massacre of Democratic liberals. But he was left holding the Great Society bag, the repudiated liberalism of the '60s. His response was to become a pragmatic Democrat, a Democrat of what he called new ideas.
What do you think is your best quality?
I think the ability to attract talent, to tap the energy and creativity of other people. That's what Roosevelt did. It's what John Kennedy did. This whole business about new ideas suggests that I am the one who has the ideas. I'm not. I have some, and I've tried to promote those. But what I've tried to do is bring together some of the most creative people in our society.
And what's your worst quality?
I'm not a very good politician in the traditional sense. I'm not a glad-hander or backslapper. That comes across in the journalistic phrase as cool and aloof. It's basic shyness, frankly.
You trade for votes?
Well, I generally don't, and I can't remember any concrete example where I've gone to anyone and said, if you'll vote for my amendment now, I'll vote for your thing then.
Why wouldn't you do that?
I don't know. It just didn't seem right. I think things ought to pass or fail on their merits, I suppose. I don't mean to sound pure, but that's the way I believe.
It does sound pure.
Well, I'm sorry.
Is pragmatic a bad word to lay on you?
No, I prefer. It has a bad name in the sense it sounds cynical. Like I'm going to do anything I can to win. In that respect, it is not a good word. If it's synonymous with innovation and willingness to experiment, then it is a good word. You know, the problem a lot of these commentators are having, if I may say so, with my candidacy and my issues is they can't figure out how to put it in a box. I've heard neoliberal, liberal, conservative, neoconservative, Atari Democrat, and none of it really matters.
None of it matters, says Gary Hart. He may be right, but that approach may also explain why he is such a detached, almost remote figure here in Washington. If he expects to unite the Democrats, the old ones as well as the young ones, he must learn occasionally to lose his cool. Roger Mudd, NBC News, Washington.
For some time now, there's been confusion about Senator Hart's age. He has been listed as being 46 years old, born in 1937. In New Hampshire, he said that was the result of an error by his staff, that he's always known that he was born in 1936. But when Hart was a Denver lawyer, he listed his birth date himself as being in 1937. Next week, of course, is Super Tuesday with more than 600 delegates at stake in 11 Democratic primaries and caucuses. Super Tuesday could, for all practical purposes, decide this race. NBC News will present a special one-hour program in prime time on the results starting at 10 p.m., 9 Central, Super Tuesday.
Coming up, James Polk at the Supreme Court as Christmas wins a narrow vote. Robert Hager in Washington on the out-of-control costs of Medicare. And Henry Champ in Beirut on cautious optimism for Lebanon's New Deal.
The Supreme Court today handed down a close decision on the sticky issue of separation between church and state. This ruling is over the displaying of nativity scenes at Christmas. James Polk tonight with the justice's decision.
In its most important religious case of this term, the court said today a city can help celebrate Christmas because it is a historic holiday. For more than 40 years, Pawtucket, Rhode Island, had set up a city-owned nativity scene as part of its Christmas display in a downtown park. Lower courts ruled this violated the separation of church and state. Pawtucket, which spent only $20 a year to put up the manger scene, argued it was like a folk festival.
Religion is ingrained in our culture, it's ingrained in our heritage, and it's impossible to wring out all these religious traditions.
The Supreme Court decision was close, 5-4. Chief Justice Berger said the nativity scene merely recognizes the tradition of a national holiday. Dissenting justices said it meant much more than that and should be unconstitutional as a public endorsement of private faith. But Berger said the case was more like the opening prayers in Congress, Christmas carols in schools, and tax exemptions for churches, all allowable. A taxpayer who lost the case.
It just represents a continued erosion of the principles of separation of church and state.
The American Jewish Congress.
It favors one religion over other religions, and it favors religion over non-religion. And both of those things have no room in this country.
The Supreme Court walked a narrow line, careful not to change any of its previous church-state decisions, but saying, in this case, the Christ child could be considered as much a public part of Christmas as Santa Claus. James Polk, NBC News, Washington.
Today, the biggest corporate takeover in American history. Gulf Oil agreed to be bought by Standard Oil of California for more than $13 billion. Gulf is the fifth largest U.S. oil company, Standard of California, the fourth. The complicated financial dealings surrounding the sale of Edwin Meese's California home continue to unravel today as the Senate considers his bid to win confirmation as Attorney General. Carl Stern tonight on what investigators found over the weekend.
There is fresh evidence that the Senate Judiciary Committee has not been getting the full story on the sale of Edwin Meese's house. Meese had serious money troubles when he was unable to sell his home in California. Senate investigators believe its eventual sale at more than $300,000 was engineered behind the scenes by men who wanted and got high government posts. Last week, the committee was told that a man named Irvin Howard was found by Mises' friends to buy the house as an investment and later sold it at a loss. Supporters of Mises' nomination produced a letter from Howard saying he sold it after 8 or 9 months when the economy worsened. But a deposition taken by Senate investigators over the weekend quotes Howard as saying he kept the house only a week or two, and that he was totally bailed out of his loss by a man associated with friends of Mises who formed a partnership with Howard's son. Question: and they reimbursed you for the amount of money that you lost? Howard: yes. The total amount? You're saying that you did not take the loss? Howard: right. The man who appears to have been behind the deal was rancher and Reagan neighbor Thomas Barrack, who shortly after the house was sold won a high post in the Interior Department and sought an even higher job in the Commerce Department. Barrack was called to testify late this afternoon.
I arranged the transaction. I negotiated the financing.
What didn't you do?
I did most of it.
The question now is whether Mises returned the favor by helping Barrack find a government job. Barrack and Mises deny it, but both face more questioning. Carl Stern, NBC News, Washington.
A major casino cheating scam apparently has been cracked in Atlantic City. Authorities today said that 2 casino dealers using marked decks helped their player partners win more than $500,000 at blackjack. The dealers put slight bumps on their cars, which were visible to the players. The scams were run last November at the Sands and at Caesars Atlantic City. A vicious twister swept through southeast Alabama this afternoon, leaving shambles in its wake. The tornado ripped through a shopping center in Ozark, Alabama, blowing the roof off one store. Then it skipped downtown and hit a trailer park, flipping over 2 mobile homes. In one home, 3 people were trapped under the rubble until rescue workers freed them. 5 other people suffered minor injuries.
Next, Henry Champ in Beirut on new hopes and new fighting as the treaty with Israel dies.
The fractured Lebanese government got back together today and formally broke that troop withdrawal deal with Israel. The scrapping of the U.S.-sponsored plan was a key demand of Syria and its Muslim allies in Lebanon. For President Gemayel, it means a tilt towards Syria and a chance for political survival. Henry Champ reports tonight that Gemayel now faces new opposition.
The decision canceling the May 17th troop withdrawal accord came at a hastily convened cabinet meeting, along with an announcement that reunification talks would start again in Switzerland and a demand Israeli troops leave their positions in South Lebanon. Reaction was immediate. In this nation of businessmen, the Lebanese pound rose by 20% against the dollar. People couldn't get rid of their dollars fast enough, and in some cases even gold. On the first day of Lent, Christian Lebanese were smiling, Muslim gunmen were relaxed, the ceasefire was holding. And students at the American University were re-registering for classes interrupted by recent fighting. Even the jaded, who had seen it all before, were optimistic.
Have there been many ceasefires?
Many, but now it is serious.
But then the trouble started. An American colonel was shot at this hotel. His condition tonight is stable, but there are growing fears of terrorist attacks on all Americans living here. Only days before his contingent is to leave, a French soldier patrolling the Green Line was killed during artillery shelling. From his headquarters, the Christian militia leader was denouncing the peace package.
What the Syrians are trying to do now is to swallow 3/4 of Lebanon and keep 1/4 to the Israelis. I think they will find the Christian area very hard to swallow.
Frem said his forces were mobilizing more men and would fight to maintain their neighborhoods. Almost at once, sniping began.
It is too early to make a judgment on this current peace process. Rhetoric is, after all, one of Lebanon's cheapest and most plentiful commodities. But the guns are a different matter. Silent only for a brief period this morning, they have been firing all day, and that is talk that must be listened to. Henry Champ, NBC News, Beirut.
In Israel today, Prime Minister Shamir said breaking the deal with his country was a death sentence for Lebanese sovereignty and a surrender to Syria. He said that Israel will decide for itself the best ways of ensuring its security. 7 American Jewish settlers were arrested today on the West Bank. Israel Radio says tonight that they're suspected of staging yesterday's West Bank bus attack in which 7 Palestinians were wounded by gunfire near Ramallah. The suspects had weapons in their possession when they were arrested today. The United States today charged Iraq with using chemical weapons against Iran. It said available evidence indicated such use. Iran says hundreds of its troops were killed last week by Iraqi chemical attacks. There was new tough talk today from the Soviet Union. In New Delhi, India, Defense Minister Ustinov accused the United States of exporting militarism and pushing the world closer to nuclear war. He cited the deployment of new U.S. missiles in Europe and the U.S. involvement in Grenada and Nicaragua. And at the White House today, Chancellor Helmut Kohl of West Germany urged an early summit meeting between President Reagan and Soviet leader Chernenko. Mr. Reagan said that he is ready for such a meeting if it is well prepared and holds the promise of fruitful results.
Next, Robert Hager in Washington on the shocking costs of Medicare.
Tonight, a special segment report on the Medicare crisis. The crisis involves money, billions of dollars needed to keep up with the ever-expanding cost of this government health program. Later this week, the Reagan administration will send Congress recommendations of an advisory council, recommendations that reportedly include raising the eligibility age from 65 to 67. Tonight, Robert Hager with the first of a two-part report on the Medicare crisis.
Come on. Come on. Come on.
Morris Roush feels better nowadays at his home in Indiana, but last summer he almost died. A heart bypass operation with complications, then phlebitis. The hospital bill, $67,000.
That's a lot of money, to say the least.
Jack Breslow lost his wife Ethel last year. She died of a massive stroke. The bill for 10 weeks in a Miami hospital, $78,000. Their daughter, Harriet.
I thought it was horrendous.
Mildred Oberteuffer suffered a heart attack last March. She was rushed to this hospital in Portland, Oregon, where she died that night. She was the mother-in-law of Senator Bob Packwood.
She was in the hospital 5 hours, perhaps. And the bill was just a couple $100 short of $10,000.
In each of these cases, Medicare paid most of the bill. But next month, Medicare's trustees will report that things can't go on like this. That at the present rate of spending, Medicare's hospital fund, supported by payroll taxes, would be broke by 1991. And in another 10 years could be $1 trillion in debt. In its first full year after President Lyndon Johnson signed Medicare into law, it paid out just over $3 billion. Last year, it paid out $57 billion. Economist Alan Greenspan, who led last year's drive to save the Social Security system.
Medicare is far more serious than Social Security.
Medicare's problems are partly the result of the aging of the population. Even more, they result from spiraling medical costs. While consumer prices went up 3.8% last year, doctors' fees increased almost twice that much, and hospital room rates went up even more. The costs of dying are particularly high.
Well, I just trust in the Lord, and when it comes time for me to go, that I'll be ready to go with him.
Her doctors thought Goldie McQuarrie would die of cancer 18 months ago. Expensive treatments have kept her alive. Almost a third of Medicare's costs are for terminal patients like Mrs. McQuarrie.
Medicare is an issue which is only indirectly financial. It reflects the choices in a society on the questions of life and death.
Another of Medicare's big problems is that there's been no incentive to save money. No incentive for doctors. It costs them nothing to put patients in the hospital. No incentive for patients who know Medicare is paying. And until recently, no incentive for hospitals, which account for 3/4 of Medicare's costs, because they also knew Medicare was paying most of the bills. Like the $78,000 bill for Ethel Breslow, who died of a stroke. When her daughter looked over what Medicare had approved, she couldn't believe it. Dozens of suppositories, $2.85 apiece. In a drugstore, they're only 30 cents each. That'd be an 800% markup. Disposable razors, $4 apiece. In a drugstore, they're 36 cents, 1,000% markup. Her total bill for hospital supplies like these, $11,596. For laboratory work, $16,118. Mrs. Breslow's daughter was appalled.
The thing that bothered me the most as a citizen was the fact that Medicare paid the bill evidently without checking in to see why these charges were so high.
So how can Medicare be saved? A crackdown on hospitals has already begun.
Doctors may freeze their prices, and there's talk of cutting the elderly's benefits or raising taxes. A look at these proposals in our next report. Robert Hager, NBC News, Washington.
Actor William Powell, who made more than 100 movies, died in a California hospital today. Powell's career ran from the silent era right up to 1954. He was best known, of course, as Nick Charles in the Thin Man detective series. Myrna Loy called him a brilliant actor and a delightful companion, but the little dog in the series had other ideas.
Oh, he's all right. Look, lie down. Lie down. Stand up. The reflex.
Powell's last film role was that of the crusty ship's doctor in Mr. Roberts, in which he starred with Henry Fonda and Jack Lemmon. William Powell, dead today at the age of 91.
B-29 over Japan.
Teach your son to throw a football. It was a skill that sure came in handy for Steve Young, the quarterback of Brigham Young University. Today he signed a contract that borders on the unbelievable. $40 million for the next 43 years with the Los Angeles Express of the U.S. Football League. And this Young is the great-great-great-grandson of Mormon pioneer Brigham Young. And remember Friday night on this program when we did a big feature on the racehorse Devil's Bag, the super horse of 3-year-olds, maybe one of the greatest horses of all time? Well, that was before the race. At the Flamingo Stakes in Hialeah, Florida over the weekend, a funny thing happened to Devil's Bag on his way to stardom. He finished 4th, way back. This after winning 6 in a row. Before that race, Devil's Bag received one of the biggest press buildups in recent memory, which means this year we have a perfect record in horse racing and presidential politics. That's Nightly News for this Monday night. I'm Tom Brokaw. Good night from all of us at NBC News.